Hello, I'm Medina County Auditor Mike Kovac, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to Community Connections. And with us today, I'm very pleased to have one of the most successful and longest serving business executives in Medina County, John Root, Chairman of the Board at AI Root, correct?
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming in, John.
AI Root was born into a family of 7 children right in the middle, and he was obviously the runt of the litter. Because he seemed to come down with everything that came along, and he was not strong and robust like his brothers were. So his father Samuel suggested that he work with his mother on the vegetable garden, and that was a very, very good thing as far as he was concerned, because she influenced him into trying to learn as much as he possibly could about the world around him. And as a result, at the tender age of 17, he became an outstanding expert in electricity, and he had a handbill made up so that he could travel around Ohio and tell people about electricity. This was 1855, and people didn't know anything about it. And in his handbill, he made thunder and lightning, and he called himself Professor Root. And he was very much in love with a young lady named Susan at the time. And she was very incensed by the fact that he was calling himself professor when he really wasn't a professor. So he told her that he would cut that part out with a pair of scissors, but you can see he actually didn't do that.
Right.
Because we have one that was complete. But what he says is he can teach anybody how to dance in a matter of seconds. And people had no idea in 1855, if they held on to a wire and had metal slippers on and were standing on a sheet of metal, that galvanic batteries could give such a shock.
And they danced pretty quickly when
Yes,
they came
they did.
through, right?
He was successful on this tour, and Susan's father had indicated that he didn't think AI would ever be able to support his daughter.
Right.
So he paid a man $50 in order to teach him the art of making jewelry. And being a jeweler was a very respected profession. It was like being a minister or a doctor or a lawyer. And he came back to Medina and began his jewelry business. And he began to manufacture gold chains and silverware. And one day, working by the light of a window, all of a sudden the light diminished. And he looked up to see if a storm cloud was coming by. And it was actually a swarm of bees that had gathered on the window, and he was fascinated by them, watching them fly and work with each other there on the window. And one of his workmen said, "Well, what would you give me if I could bring them down and put them in a box for you?" He didn't think that was possible, so he offered him a day's wages, which was $1 then.
Right.
And this man understood that if you got a hold of the queen and brought her down, all the bees would follow her. And so he presented him with his box of bees, and he took them home and showed them to Susan. And Susan said, "You paid what for that box of bugs?"
That's right.
But the next morning he decided to go to Cleveland, which was quite an arduous trip by buggy, to find out all he could about bees. And he went to a bookstore and found a book by Lorenzo Langstroth from Philadelphia, a congregational minister, who had taken the fact that Aristotle discovered that if you give a bee a space less than 1/4 of an inch, she'll take resin from trees, a very sticky substance we call propolis, and fill that space with that. And if you give a bee a space more than 3/8 of an inch, she'll build honeycomb in that space. But if you keep the spacing between 1/4 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch, she won't put anything in there. So this minister had the idea of developing a beehive that you could take the combs out, because the bees wouldn't stick the combs in, and they'd been killing the bees in order to harvest the honey. And they were fortunate to be able to produce as much as 5 pounds of honey in a season as a result of killing the productive capacity of the colony when you harvest the honey. So this beehive made a big difference, but there had been 5 years since the book had been published, and no beekeepers were using this hive. So AI made the hive and found that it was made from non-standard lumber, and it was not very rugged. It was more like a violin than it was a piece of agricultural equipment. And so he made it from standard lumber and made it more rugged so that it could take the stresses of a farming operation, and began to manufacture the hives. And he paid Langstroth a royalty through his whole life for each hive that he manufactured. But this made it possible for beekeepers then to produce 50, 60, 70 pounds of honey a year. And he began to sell the hives made by a saw that he ran by windmill power. He didn't like steam. In 1873, there was a terrible fire as a result of a steam engine on that part of the public square, and his facility burned down. But he had insurance on it, so he rebuilt it. Insurance from Westfield, which was called Ohio Farmers at the time. My grandfather said that when he heard the wind blowing at night, even when he was an older man, he said it always made him nervous because he thought his father would wake him up and ask him to go down to the shop to make beehives.
Had to work when the wind was blowing. Right?
So he started his beekeeping business in 1869, which was a year of Black Friday, when a lot of banks failed. But it was also the year that they drove the Golden Spike in the Transcontinental Railroad linking New York City and San Francisco. And so he realized the potential for this. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad came through Medina at that time, and he wanted to be next to the railroad so he could ship his beehives all over the country. And so he began to negotiate with the county commissioners to buy the old fire fairgrounds because they were moving to a new site on the other side of Smith Road. And he finally made a deal with them and built that first building. And he faced it toward the railroad, and actually it says, "In God We Trust," 1878, which was not the founding of the company. The company was founded in 1869, which was 140 years ago now. That was 7 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and 10 years before Thomas Edison invented the electric light. So that sort of sets the stage for when it was.
Well, again, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to come in today, John. It's outstanding, and if you have not heard of the history of AI Root, it's certainly something you want to share with your friends and family. We certainly appreciate you tuning in today. This has been Community Connections, and I'm Mike Kovac, Medina County Auditor.